I saw an episode that well, not an episode, but I saw that whatever podcast that you did. I wanted to ask you about that on this show as well, because we exchanged some brief, comments on that too by email. But I've seen this trend now where podcasts, and I did this video. I know that you watched the whole thing because you saw the shout out that I did in there. But I've seen this trend, just for people that are watching that aren't familiar with that concept, that there's a lot of podcasts now that sort of have just come up, and it's tables, sit down, and it seems to rely on putting a bunch of people at a table. When they put women at the table, it doesn't seem like they're picking the best from the available inventory of women that are out there on the sexual marketplace, and it's let's make bimbos look dumb, I guess is probably the best way to summarize it. You sat down at one of these podcasts at this table, and I only watched the clips. I didn't watch the full podcast from beginning to end, but there's a few times I could tell when you were sitting there, and it's like the professional in the room looks a little bit uncomfortable with some of these questions and the way the conversation was going. What's your thought as a professional when now that you've sat in one of those tables and you've seen some of these, obviously, these podcasts, like, what's your feelings on that? I'm curious.
Well, I'm happy to have done the experience. It was a strange one for me. I have to admit, I told this to Brian, the host of Whatever, that I hadn't seen an episode of Whatever before when he reached out. And I did some very cursory research, and I looked at a couple of episodes, some clips. I watched maybe 5 minutes. And what I saw in these clips was there's like 4 or 5 guys on one side of the table, 4 or 5 women on the other, and they're actually having a discussion about relationships, intersexual dynamics. And I was like, oh, that sounds interesting, because, the men are actually saying these things to the women's face, and the women get a chance to respond to them. Mm-hmm. And I thought that was an interesting dynamic, rather than just guys just sort of spouting off into their echo chambers. It's actually a dialogue. And I thought, okay, I could sign up for that. Mm-hmm. And so I decided to go down to do the podcast. Now, on the episode that you did, I didn't watch the whole thing. I just sort of skimmed around, and I'm not surprised that you didn't watch the whole Whatever podcast. I was surprised that it went on for 5 hours. It was an endurance challenge for me. That was I can't believe that there might have been people who sat through the whole thing. It was hard for me sometimes.
It's common, and it draws a lot of eyeballs, which is somewhat surprising. It's like the car crash. People always look at the car crash when they're driving on the highway, and it almost seems like this is what we're watching for 5 hours.
Sure. And in your episode on that podcast, you mentioned Jerry Springer a bunch of times.
Yeah.
Now, Brian received me very well when I went down to Santa Barbara to be on the podcast. We had a phone conversation before I went on, and he called the podcast the Jerry Springer Show of YouTube. So I think Brian I don't know him very well. I just met him that one time, but I think he's self-aware about what he's doing.
Yeah.
I think that he is intentionally choosing women who their optics look unusual, because that's going to be provocative or interesting. He's definitely in entertainment, and I don't think that he has any illusions about what he's doing, as far as I can tell.
Yeah, I mean, the optics of the whole thing was, there's an Asian girl sitting in the back corner with a spiky hat petting a little black baby, and there's a woman dressed up as a cat, opposing the table. And
everyone talks about the girl with the baby, but she was behind me, so I couldn't see what she was doing the whole time. But that's
it was distracting, because I'm watching the professional talk and sort of explain concepts, and I see this girl over your shoulder making bizarre faces, almost talking to herself, stroking a black baby doll sort of thing with a little spiky hat. And I thought to myself, wow.
Brian referred to her as the mascot. So I assume that she's there because it's like a baseball game. It's 5 hours long, and there's going to be a lot of downtime. And so she's there to kind of keep the audience engaged. That's my
so the Jerry Springer of YouTube, at least they understand what they're doing. Okay.
That podcast started a year ago, and it has over 4 million subscribers, which is incredible.
Well, I mean, in fairness, the channel, when you look at it from the older videos, it was mostly a prank channel. So they would use the telephoto lens with a wired up, wireless mic, and they would prank people, at a distance and record it. And
sure,
I guess
Brian told me that. He told me that too, and it's all founded in entertainment. Yeah, and I don't think that he thinks that he's doing anything but that.
Do you think there's any use in the content that's being created for guys? Because it would seem to be mostly guys. I mean, judging by the live chats that they're dealing with. Is there any benefit to men watching 5 hours of the back and forth between men and women orchestrated in a, I mean, it's not as bad as Jerry Springer where, you know, security has to come running out and separating people from fights, but people do get thrown off the show. They get removed. They get put in checkmate. There's always, you know, clickbaity type of thumbnails where like, you know, she was triggered or something like that. And there's an arrow pointed to somebody with a strange face. How do you recommend guys navigate that so they get benefit from it? I guess is, you know, the way that I'm trying to phrase this question to make it useful. Or is it even possible to do that?
I've thought about this a little bit because you got podcasts like Whatever and you got Fresh and Fit, and they're both very, very popular, and they both play with red pill intersexual dynamics, and they have extremely high viewership. And so I thought, well, what is really going on here? And the best I could come up with, among other things, is it's kind of a male fantasy, because when you turn into these shows, you can generally expect that the men, if they're not going to win, they're going to be made to look really good. And oftentimes, you know, sometimes they have these ridiculous looking folks on these podcasts, but they also have really traditionally attractive women too. You got smoke shows in tight cocktail dresses, and the fantasy is that you have these men who are telling them that they're wrong, who are telling them that they're actually not getting what they want. It's like they're beating them in a dialogue about relationships. And I think that's like very vicariously satisfying to a lot of male viewers who might not even have the courage to approach one of these women in everyday life. If they were to see them, they can tune in and listen to guys put these really attractive women in their place. And I think that's part of the male fantasy that supports their viewership.
I would agree with that. So is it bimbos being made to look dumb? Is that what they are?
Well, again, it's complicated. After that recording, I did chat briefly with a couple of the women who are on that episode, and they also didn't seem to be like, just like Brian seemed to know what he was doing, that he was kind of a Jerry Springer show. The women kind of knew what they were doing, and they talked about their social media, like their podcast personas, and they were playing up parts of themselves so that they could potentially be invited to more podcasts. I don't know what they get out of it. Maybe they get free tickets or hotel rooms. I'm not sure, but or maybe
I think it's exposure for their social media and their OnlyFans if they have one.
It could very well be. And I think that those women they see it as a business opportunity. So I'm not quite sure to what extent a lot of those women are, let's say, authentically presenting themselves. I think it could be a persona.
Do you think it's an accurate representation of the female demographic that's out there today?
On like women in the sexual marketplace or on OnlyFans?
No, like on these podcasts. Like, do you think these women that are showing up on these podcasts are an accurate representation of the general female population out there?
No, I don't. But sometimes it's like science sometimes studies really extreme habitats because it's under these conditions that we can see more universal truths about life. Like if life can thrive here in these environments, then maybe we can learn something that's universally true. And so maybe one of the didactic takeaways of these podcasts is these women are extreme examples, and we can see in these extreme examples some principles that may be present to a lesser degree universally among women or even among people. Yeah. But it's easier to see in these extreme examples.
Yeah, it's a fascinating dynamic that's only arisen the last couple of years. I think Howard Stern is probably the closest thing that you might relate it to. Like he might be the OG, or even Tom Likas. Are you familiar with Tom Likas?
No, but I met Howard Stern a few times, and he's a nice guy. When I was an actor, I actually was doing a show with his daughter. She was my love interest. So I made out with Howard Stern's daughter on stage every night. And he was a great dad. He came to the show multiple times. And it was not only strange to meet the celebrity, but also that I was hooking up with his daughter on stage.
I'll share a story with you after we come off air. Remind me when we end the show because I can't talk about it live. But yeah, it's like, you know, the whole Howard Stern, like Tom Likas was probably one of the first guys that were, because he ran a radio show, right? So there's no video of it, but there's mostly like loads and loads of audio recordings out there. So if you search on YouTube for Tom Likas, you'll see a lot of these playbacks where it's like he's dealing with people calling in and they're asking questions about dating. A lot of the stuff that, you know, you and I even have covered today or in the past few years, you know, something that's been talked about before. And I'm sure it's been, you know, it was talked about in the 50s, 60s, and 70s by other people. I just don't know who. But like the sit down podcast sort of thing that has just happened is, it's bizarre in the sense where it's like, I see the car crash, I'm watching it unfold in slow motion, literally over 5 hours if you watch the whole thing. And then you're right. I think a lot of the people that are watching it, especially the guys, it's like this like vindication, like this validation, like the aha, gotcha, you know, sort of thing. And I think that's what draws them in. And I don't know, like, I'm still struggling, I guess, at this point, you know, as we're talking about it, to at least offer some kind of benefit, solution, use case for guys, aside from that like vindication, like, you know, gotcha, bitch, you know, sort of thing, which seems to be the angle. I'm just wondering if it even exists.
I don't know. I mean, it could just be pure entertainment. I mean, not everything has to have a nutritional value, as it were. People binge all kinds of reality shows on TV that I don't know if they really help people become better versions of themselves.
Yeah, I guess I always look for the nutritional value. Maybe that's just my perspective of things.
I mean, Brian did try to bring some things. He talked about the divorce rates and the way that men kind of get shafted in the court system. The fresh and fit guys, they have good points. So maybe if men haven't really heard about the red pill before, this could be a way that they get exposed to some of these ideas. I'm not sure.
Good. All right. So let's move on for that. So let me ask you a question about marriage then. So you're a single guy, or do you have a girlfriend? Like, what's your status right now?
I'm seeing somebody, but I'm unmarried.
Awesome. So would you ever get married, knowing what you know about family law and about the dynamics between men and women in the modern world today?
I wouldn't say never, but I would be very cautious around getting married for a number of reasons. I've seen divorce up close. I'm the child of divorce. My father was the child of divorce. My parents' divorce took 3 years. It was extremely painful.
How old were you when they went through it?
I was 15.
Okay.
And in large part because of that divorce, my dad spent his 50s and part of his 60s in a one-room studio apartment, and that's how he had to live. Mm-hmm. And this is a man who, my mother worked maybe a year or two in her life, who cared and took and provided for me and my sister and my mother, and this was his reward at the end of the day. So I see how divorce can destroy men's lives. Here in California, I've worked with a number of guys navigate their divorces. It takes at least a year and a half. You pay for the woman's lawyer. There's no incentive that this is going to be an easy, quick process. There's a lot of incentives. My point is, I'm not really sure what guys get out of marriage, like the actual legal contract. Mm-hmm. You can have a long-term committed relationship without marriage. You can have children without marriage. Like the arguments, you know, that used to not really be the case, but that's maybe one of the benefits of the modern age, is that we can kind of deconstruct marriage, and we can take the things that we want and leave the rest. I have this idea that, like, I think marriage is primarily for the security of a woman. And I think that made more sense when women couldn't or wouldn't make their own money. Mm-hmm. And now in the modern day, a lot of women are doing extraordinarily well. Women under 30 who are childless are generally out earning men in that same demographic. The idea that that women need the security of that relationship is, I think, a little bit outdated. I think it has to do with their diminishing sexual marketplace value and their need for, let's say, companionate love, which might be greater in women than it is for men. I like Patrice O'Neill's take on it, which is that men generally they want women to be, men want to be alone, but not by
Mhm.
themselves. So they kind of, they want their own space and they want the women kind of around. And to me, that works out great. So I live by myself. I've had long-term committed relationships, and my girlfriends have, they know my positions on marriage. So if they're going to stick it around, it's because potentially there's enough value left over for them to do so.
Mm.
And I think for a lot of women, if the relationship is strong, they're willing to forego the legal contract. I think that's one of the first things they're willing to dispense with.
Yeah, I've said this quite a few times privately on consults and with guys in my group, and we have discussions about this sort of thing. And surprisingly, women will abandon their demands and parts of their sexual strategy and adopt yours if they see you as a high enough value guy.
Sure.
That being said, marriage can be avoided. You can still have relationships with women. Like, for myself, I'm in a non-cohabitating LTR. I've been with my gal for years. She's awesome. We live in 2 separate houses. Sometimes, we live together on, short stints for a vacation or whatever. But then there comes a question for guys also, because let's be honest. The reason why we're walking this earth is to scatter seed and to pass on our DNA. It's like, okay, now how do you have children? So I guess the next question for you, sir, is, do you want to have kids? And if you did, what is your strategy for doing that to minimize the risks?
Well, I go back and forth. So I'm at the place where I feel like I will only move forward if it's an enthusiastic yes on my end. And I'm not there yet, because I've seen I'm the only unmarried childless friend that I have in my friend group.
Mhm.
And so I've seen what happens to men once they get married and really when they have kids. And I don't see them that much anymore. They spend half of their waking lives earning money and the other half of their lives taking care of the kids and the wife and just being domesticated.
Mhm.
A lot of these men love it. And if that works for them, fantastic. They love their little family lives, and that's what they've dreamt about since they were young men, and they got it. Great. I hope it works out for them. What I've also seen, though, is that the amount of sacrifice required in terms of time, energy, and money to have one woman and to have a family is considerable. And I think about, like, I'm working on a book. Would I be able to write a book if I had a kid? Would I be able to travel the world if I wanted to have a kid? I think it's possible, but it's much, much harder, and you need a lot of money to do it.
Mhm.
And also a flexible, open-minded, committed woman who's willing to kind of roll with it and occupy that place in your frame.
I really hope you guys enjoyed that clip. If you want to watch the full-length podcast, you can find that over here, that clip's from. If you're newer to the channel, make sure you hit subscribe over here, and pin down below in the top comment, you'll find a bunch of useful links to my website, my supplement line, books, and a bunch of other stuff. Have an amazing day. Peace out.